Welcome, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Marianne Hensley. I am the Vice President of Media Operations for FreightWaves, and we are happy to present today's webinar in partnership with Redwood Logistics. I'm excited to be here today as we discuss the findings of our latest research that was conducted in partnership with Redwood and focuses on sustainability in the supply chain. I am joined by Andrew Cox, Senior Analyst here at FreightWaves, to talk through the findings of the study, as well as Eric Rempel, Chief Innovation Officer for Redwood, who's going to be sharing his thoughts around how all of this is playing out in the industry as well. And both speakers will be joining us for some questions after the presentation as well, so be sure to send those questions along as they come to you. Before we get started, just a couple of quick items. First, if you have any issues during the webinar, you can reach out to our team via the group chat function in your webinar console. And if you have questions that you would like to ask Andrew and Eric, you can enter those through the Q&A box in your control panel, and we will get to as many of those as possible after the presentation. We will also be sending a link to the recording of this webinar tomorrow in case you'd like to view it on demand or share it with your colleagues. And at this point, without further ado, I will go ahead and turn it over to Andrew to kick off today's discussion. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks so much, Marianne, and thanks everyone for joining. Thanks again to Redwood and to Eric for joining us today as well. Like Marianne said, we're going to go over this most recent survey that we did with Redwood. It was completed towards the end of last month. So it's a very fresh data here about sustainability initiatives, and it was aimed at shippers. So here's just some quick background on the respondents that we had. So we had about 25%, a quarter of them came in CPG, and then about another 30% between general manufacturing and retail, and then the remainder kind of spread out between the other categories. An estimated annual spend on transportation and shipping. We've got a pretty decent mix here. I'd say this is it's a lot like many of the other shipper surveys we have. We have quite a few very big ones, and then a pretty big base of really small ones as well. So you get a good diverse look at sustainability initiatives here. So let's jump right into our first question before we bring Eric in. So the first question is, how are these goals driving management decision and corporate strategy? And the first thing that kind of pops off the page to me from this question was that supply chain is foundational to any sustainability goals and initiatives. The first response here, about 45% say that their goals have helped them create plans for future strategy decisions. And then redesigning the supply chain network is the second result there. I won't read all of them for you and go all the way down. But Eric, we can start here. Why do you think these sustainability goals are focused on the supply chain? And only 10% of these don't have goals. I think that's a good point. That's consistent throughout the survey. 90% do have goals. But just discuss briefly why you think the supply chain is so foundational to these goals and decision making.
Yeah, I think just speaking candidly, because we're all at different parts of our journey around, ESG initiatives, but, to the 10% that are unsure, I think that is probably around, you can't really improve what you don't measure. And so if you're not measuring it as a baseline, it's difficult to figure out where you want to go. In terms of the other part of your question, I think that it's really, what do you want to accomplish from this? And is it around lean or is it around green? And how do we kind of bring those together? So I think as we go through the rest of this presentation, we'll probably find some neat correlations between where, saving money and reducing miles is aligned with, environmental and sustainability initiatives.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Eric. The financial benefits must be aligned with the sustainability or the sustainable benefits here as well. So let's move on to our next question. As Eric said, we're all in different stages of our implementation here, but we're still very early. That's kind of the broad stroke to paint here. As we said, only about 10% say they don't have plans for a sustainability strategy. And then you've got about a 15% in the discussion phase, 25 in the planning, 20 in implementation, and another 20 in execution. So, Eric, what do you think? Let's talk briefly. Let's talk one about COVID and also about kind of a timeline. Walk us through a timeline. How quickly can a mid-sized retailer in the U.S. work through the discussion, planning, implementation, and get to the execution phase?
Yeah, so if you take it back, take a step back and look at, perhaps what you see in the news and, in some headlines, you've got companies like Unilever and Starbucks and Nike and Apple and Microsoft, right? They've all set these really ambitious targets around sustainability and carbon neutrality by 2030, right? Some are 100%, some are, a percentage, on its way there, but, they're not all organizations are part of the Fortune 50. So, in terms of regular companies, and what can happen there, I think it's important to kind of reiterate, what I said in the first step, which is the first is it part of corporate governance? Is it part of what the organization believes is important, core to its mission, core to its values, and core to the bottom line? And then you start with measuring that current state. Where are we today? And then, not trying to build Rome in a day, which is what are the biggest wins, right? Can we identify places that we can measure and then, put initiatives in place to offset it, and then drive that change and rinse and repeat until the level of effort, is continues to be greater than or continues to be less than the win that you get at the end of the day. So by putting in place, first is that high level, desire to run down that path, and then things like carbon accounting, smart sourcing, compliance reporting, and even carbon offsetting, that's really how you got to get there. And truthfully, and I think we're going to talk about it in some future slides, you need internal forces and you need external forces to get us there, but it has to start with the organization itself wanting to go down that path.
And Eric, have you seen a acceleration of adoption, or at least the discussion of adopting more sustainable practices because of the pandemic, or at least through the pandemic? It seems, at least from my viewpoint, looking at retailers, that's what kind of my main role here is at FreightWaves, is that we have seen an acceleration. When supply chains got stressed, retailers took the time to take a step back and think, how can we make this more sustainable? There's been more plans set out, more goals set out. Have you seen the same thing from other parts of the supply chain?
Yeah, we definitely have. But I also think that, there's two topics there, right? One is the stress and the burden on the supply chain because of COVID and all of that demand coming back nearly simultaneously. And, the supply chain pipes can only handle so much traffic. And so surely things are going to break. And then add on top of that, things like, ports getting shut down because of, infections and outbreaks and stuff like that. That just continues to be a compounding factor. But, overall, I think that, there is this trend and this pattern toward sustainability initiatives, and we're seeing it even, completely unrelated to the pandemic. We're really seeing it in terms of how are we going to measure ourselves? We see what's going on in Europe with the requirement of reporting if you've got over 500 employees. Will there be, legislation in the United States to do something similar? And so organizations obviously have to prepare, especially if they're on the larger end, and there will be regulation around it. But in general, I think that, you can have, two different initiatives. One is the objective to have sustainable supply chains, and then the second is trying to optimize those supply chains because of the forces of almost instant ramp up of demand. And if you can get a win where both are hit simultaneously, obviously that's a nice to have.
Yeah, certainly so. Two birds. All right, let's move on to our next question, slide number 5. We asked them, what are the biggest areas of focus in the supply chain that you're trying to make more sustainable? And the overwhelming response here is transportation and logistics. We kind of need to throw it out there that we are doing the survey to a FreightWaves audience, so it's definitely transportation and logistics minded. But Eric, why do you think transportation and logistics is the top pick? Do you think there's simply more low-hanging fruit there, or is this where the most meaningful changes need to be made?
Yeah, I think it's just following the data, so there was a McKinsey study recently, and in 2019, it said that about 30% of global CO2 was produced through supply chain activity, and 50% of that was through the movement of freight, right? So transportation and logistics. And so if you just follow the data, right, that's where there's, opportunity. So if you look at that 50%, right, you break it down, 20% of that, right, is for food and agriculture. So there's just so much room to follow the data when you look at supply chains. you know the commodity on board, you can calculate, the emissions of the truck, right? You can, depending on the sector, whether it's food or construction or fashion or CPG, you can look at the supply chain itself and, what actual products go into it. But the transportation and logistics, when you have either raw material or finished goods, and you're measuring those origin and destinations and the utilization of, containers, whether it's truckload or actual containers, or, even if you're shipping LTL, how do you maximize that while, still, meeting your customer, commitments? So I think it's just, you might want to call it low-hanging fruit, but perhaps it's the most measured fruit as well.
That's a good way to put it. I had a conversation with Susie Schoenberg, the head of Flexport.org, several months ago, and she made a statement that has stuck with me for a long time. She said, if ocean shipping was a country, it would be the 6th largest emitting country of carbon in the world. So it's certainly a big area that can be tackled.
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely.
Let's move on to number 6. So we asked what actions your company has or could have implemented to make significant progress towards achieving your sustainability goals. And number 1 is distribution network. 50% of respondents selected that. And number 2, at just over 40%, is eliminating empty miles. This is certainly a big point of emphasis. Eric, what are some of the things that shippers can do or are doing in respect to their distribution networks to become a more sustainable operation? Just kind of dispel that for us.
Yeah, I like this result in this slide and the way it's sorted, and I find it really interesting, and here's why. If you look at the top and you look at the distribution network, that's something that if you go back to, doing this with data, right, and how do you identify the opportunity through data? If you start at the top and you have a distribution network, well, when you run your annual RFP, right, your top lanes, where you're shipping from and shipping to, you can identify that, and, you could run various analyses to figure out, well, if I had a DC or, regional DC, in these geographies, what would the cost and what would the output of that be? But also, what does my network look like there? That's, mathematically, that's almost the easiest one to figure out. So you can look at, where do I keep my products? Where are my customers? Where are my suppliers? And how do I put them in an optimal place? From there, eliminating empty miles is almost, somewhat overlapping, but the next logical one, which is, okay, this is now where I know where my distribution centers are, but can I run optimization algorithms to consolidate freight? Can I move LTL into truckload, or can I move parcel and zone skip and, send it into a UPS or FedEx hub, elsewhere across the country? And so you look at those two, and they're very measurable and they're very, actionable. From there, it starts getting a bit murky, right? And so then you see carbon offsetting, and you say, well, within carbon, I kind of know, I can measure my miles, and I know what kind of CO2 I'm spitting out if I'm assuming, 5 or 6 miles per gallon of a traditional Class 8 truck, But then it's like, well, I could just pay to offset that carbon output. From there, then you're saying, okay, manufacturing, and what are my emissions of actually producing the materials and the raw sourcing, and who do I get it from? Those choices can sometimes be limited, especially if you're a mid-market organization. So I think it's neat, this slide in general, because it really does show the order of operations of which you should look at your network and try to find that. Again, we keep repeating it, but I think it's the right way to look at it, which is, what's the lowest hanging fruit? And when you have a TMS that, measures and tracks this, and you can just run simple reports, this can be, I don't want to call it straightforward, but certainly not a Herculean task.
Right, makes it much more actionable. Yeah, that's a great point, Eric. Just order of operations here, kind of not only, we're not going to say easiest by any means, but most manageable from top to bottom there.
Right.
All right. So our next slide here, we've got, and this I think, at least for me, might be the most important slide of the entire presentation. And I think this opens up a discussion on the cost-benefit analysis of implementing a carbon reduction strategy, because we asked, what is the most challenging aspects of implementing a carbon reduction strategy? And remaining competitive was the overwhelming number 1 response. And it seems completely backwards to me. And Eric, tell me if I'm wrong here, because and we'll learn this in a later slide when we're talking about who's driving adoption. But implementing a carbon reduction strategy is vital to remaining competitive. Consumers are going to vote with their wallets, as we're going to see later in the deck. So am I wrong there in thinking that this is a little bit backwards, and you must, or at least you should be having these discussions if you want to continue remaining competitive, Eric?
Yeah, I'll kind of phrase it this way, which is what I tell my kids when they're fighting. The answer is kind of somewhere in the middle. There's two sides to every story. So I think you're right. Consumers certainly vote with their wallets, and you saw some of the backlash to companies like North Face and Patagonia, and just kind of what happens when consumers find out, that there are, some less than stellar practices within a supply chain. But on the flip side, it's a profit game, and these companies need to make money, and they need to, make sure that they're around as a business so that they can, have a sustainable supply chain. And what I really mean by that is, if you think about remaining competitive as an answer, it's how do I offer the best product at the best price? And then now I don't have a good, reliable way to implement a environmental and sustainability initiative, either because I don't know how yet, or I don't have the data, or I can't measure it. Now I have to put a team in place. I have to, perhaps buy carbon offsets. I have to do these things where maybe there's, we're not talking Fortune 50, but to your, survey correspondents at the beginning, the $1 to $20 million in freight spend, maybe they're running on razor thin margins, and this would be highly challenging for them to remain competitive without raising prices. So this is where I think that we talked about what can a company do, right? That change starts from the top, and in a few slides I think we're going to talk about a bottom-up approach. But it's really about can there be playbooks out there that are easier to run, easier to get to, so that you can modify your supply chain without worrying about having to increase your costs exponentially?
Yeah, Eric, tell me if this statement is true for this as well, but I've heard this statement made about e-commerce, and I've heard it made about ship from store to retailers, but it's just kind of a broad statement that I think fits here. And then I've got a follow-up on accounting for you. But it's, if you ignore this, you're going to ignore it at your peril, but that doesn't exactly mean you should embrace it, but you should discuss it. You should you should look into it, right? And then also kind of the question is on accounting. So some of the notable others on this, on the side of our presentation here. So about 15% of respondents did select other. So I brought forward a couple of the notable ones here. And one of the ones that jumps off is accounting, because we've talked about this briefly. We've touched on it in the previous couple slides, but talk to me about some of the challenges of doing the correct accounting, and how has it been for you guys trying to do this, and what are your thoughts on just the difficulties of accounting for this?
Yeah, so let's take the sustainability side off of the fence, and perhaps let's align this. Well, let me answer your first question first, right? In terms of the organization, I don't think that being an ostrich, taking that approach and putting your head in the sand for this is what any company should do. Period. You have to have a plan. You have to start measuring yourself, and you have to figure out how you can, to that first point, remain competitive while still putting a plan in place. But to your point on accounting. If we look at it from a point of view where it's aligned to, something I think a lot of people on the call will understand is, when you provide solutions to shippers, the question is always, what have you done for me lately? You redesign a network, and, you say, oh, well, that was last year. And, this is my new baseline. No one really keeps that old baseline of what it was before they started doing this. So it's almost, you have to, it's as if you're running a general ledger of how you would spend, before optimization and post optimization. And that can be challenging, right? It's hard enough to get, standard GAAP accounting reporting on what you do within an organization. Now, think about accounting around carbon and, pollutants, and keeping a track of what your output would have been like before and after any kind of optimization. It's like once it's in place, everyone forgets about the past. So that's a challenging side of accounting. And, how do you continue to measure something if you can't continue to measure the baseline before you've made that change? Consolidation and optimization, right? With around freight, you can do that where if your business process is everything comes through and you see it non-consolidated, and then you optimize it and you can measure daily what that delta is, but not everyone is doing that, and not everyone can do that. So that's where I see some challenges there. But again, it all comes down to playbooks and repeatability, right? Once some folks figure out the right ways to do this and good standard procedures and how you have to report on this, especially if it becomes a regulation initiative like in Europe, then I think people will have a little bit of a hand leading them towards how to do this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I'm hearing we're getting to some inklings of how important partnerships may be in this effort.
That's for
All right,
sure.
so let's move on to slide number 8. So this one's on technology. We asked, in what ways is your company utilizing technology to reach its sustainability goals? And there's only 3 options here, but automation came as a top one of about 45% chose automation. But Eric, automation is quite a broad term. Can you try to connect some of the dots for us? What are some of the things that are being automated or can be automated that can help reach sustainability goals?
Yeah, I mean, you're asking an innovation guy, right? So like, I see everything as a Rube Goldberg machine that's overly complex. But you know, I think in terms of automation, if we break it down to the simplest part, it's data, right? Like, do you have control of your data pipelines the same way you have control of your physical supply chain network? Do you know where your data is going? Meaning, can you intercept it, put it into a data warehouse, and either act on it or measure it or report on it? And then from there, you can talk about things like RPA and bots and even automation within the warehouse and lights out automation. And there's so much stuff you can do, but you have to have a data-driven supply chain, and you have to have connectivity between all of your systems to really get the benefit of any type of automation. Otherwise, you're trying to make decisions off of stale data. And that makes this kind of a moot point, right? Which is you're optimizing in the real world with stale data. It doesn't work.
Right. So if we're keeping a running track of things to do, 1, you got to have data to drive it. 2, then you've got to use that data to measure yourself and create a baseline. So we'll keep a running track of those throughout the presentation. All right, number 9, slide 9 here. So, as we said, only 10% haven't set goals yet. So 90% have, but most have not added roles. More than 50% say they haven't added any new roles. And then you've got 20% each have added a director level and a VP, and 10% have added a sustainability officer to the C-suite. Eric, is it necessary to add new knowledge or expertise to accomplish sustainability goals? And if so, what roles can be most impactful? I don't know if you guys have added any at Redwood that have been impactful, but just thinking out loud about the types of roles that are added, I think would be helpful as well.
Yeah, what we've done from a board level down is we've kind of assigned sustainability goals and initiatives and reporting requirements to a few key leaders within the organization, and they've delegated on out from there. We haven't we don't have a single person in charge of this, but we have several people who have specific goals that they have to hit in terms of reporting on what we do and putting processes in place around improving them. So to your question, do I think it's required? No, I don't think it's required. I think moving forward, it probably will. You'll see more and more of this in organizations. But for now, I would argue that if it's part of the company mission, and then at the top, right, whether it's the CEO, the COO, or even VP or director level, if they're pushing governance around daily operations and really around how do we report on what we do, not just from a financial perspective, but from a sustainability perspective, then that becomes part of the company fabric and the company culture. And if you can drive change within your company around any cultural initiative, I think you could certainly drive change around this without having to hire someone. Having said that, it doesn't hurt by any means, and it depends on the size of your company. But if it's important to the company goals and mission and vision, you can get it done.
Yeah, sorry, I was looking something up because I didn't think there was, but it's just thinking of that, if it starts from the top of the culture and works its way down, if it's something that is in the mission. I think of, Tesla, for example. You don't see Tesla having a chief sustainability officer because sustainability is embedded in every role throughout the entire company.
That's right.
And I'm making sure that that was true. Okay. All right, number 10. So these are about training programs. We asked, what types of training has your company created to educate employees and stakeholders about reducing carbon emissions in the supply chain? So about 40% say that they have implemented either internally or have had some training from outside, the vast majority of that coming from internally created training programs. And then you got about a third that have discussed training but have not planned it, and then about a third there that have not discussed training. at all. So, the same question is training a prerequisite for, implementing sustainability implementation? And if so, what does this training kind of look like, Eric?
To the first part, is it important? Yeah, training is certainly important. What does it look like varies very much by company. If you're a shipper, you're probably taking a more holistic look at your supply chain, your providers, where you source material from, how you manufacture it. If you're a 3PL or simply focused on the transportation part of this, training could be that, we look at, our managed transportation network, and we make optimization and consolidation, table stakes, right? And not something that is, a la carte. And then that becomes part of the procedure. And again, I'll kind of go back to what I said on previous slides. If it's part of the company mission and there's governance around it, you can then train with daily execution, and it just becomes part of the standard operating procedure and onboarding. It's part of your culture. Certainly regulatory incentives, can help. And then again, going back to the EU and what's going on there, there's the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, where if you've got over 500 employees, you have to report your emissions data, and it's at its early stages, but simply the act of having to hold yourself accountable by reporting on it, can lead, organizations to then say, man, we really need to train our folks to operate this way, and then give us the data so that it becomes part of, our operating procedures at a reporting level. So training is like anything in an organization. It's a means to an end, but you have to know what your end is first before you train on it.
Right, that makes total sense too. Maybe if there's any brokers in the crowd that are listening, and that basically financially aligned people, sellers, is it important to align the potential financial benefits of sustainability programs to the workers, to show them, hey, this is what this can do for the company, not only from a marketability standpoint, we can come out and use these as marketing tools to grow customer loyalty, to drive innovation, so on and so forth. But also, this could make us more money. This can save the company money or make the company money. Is that something that needs to be explained?
I think that varies from company to company. The carrot and the stick analogy, and, is it intrinsic, motivation or extrinsic motivation? I think that really depends from company to company. But I think that if at the highest level there's a company goal and mission around, environmental stewardship, then it'll happen, whether there's a carrot dangling there or not. I think that's just a company by company thing.
Fair enough. Good insight there. Thank you. All right, slide number 11. So we asked the shippers, what are some carbon reduction initiatives that your company has that could or has requested from your transportation partners? And so freight consolidation was number one. Over 60% of respondents chose that one. Fuel efficiency and reducing empty miles, the second to about 45%. And so obviously electric trucks and alternative fuel trucks are on their way, but it's going to be a while before we can get our fleet transitioned to more, greener energy sources. So there's a lot that we can and must do to reduce carbon emissions in the meantime. So Eric, talk me through conversations you've had with clients that have been looking to consolidate their freight. What does that look like?
Yeah, I like this result here too. You look at consolidation, fuel, mile reduction, which I guess you could, depending on how you define consolidation, there can be a little bit there. But for us, it's pretty straightforward. When we onboard customers and we look at consolidating their freight, back to my previous points, the most important thing is that we have their data and that it's running in near real time into the TMS. And so, our whole thing was, you can't measure you can't improve what you don't measure. And if the data is not there fast enough, optimization and freight consolidation becomes nearly impossible because, is it picked? Is it packed? Is it staged? Is it wrapped already? And undoing that physical work that happens on the dock or on the floor. If you're getting instructions that are too late, you're out of luck. So the first is, are the WMS and the TMS in tight unison, right? And are they communicating properly? The second part is, do you have procedures in place around how long do I have? Can I drop it early? Can I pick it early? Can I drop late? If the savings is a certain amount, or if, I can save a certain number of miles, or, I can consolidate with something that I know is supposed to drop tomorrow, but I'm going to wait. So there's a lot of business logic and rules that go into some of these consolidation algorithms. But at the highest level, it's, can we hit that 80-20, right? Because there's always going to be exceptions, and you have an area for that where you just let it keep flying in real time. But if you can capture 80% with 20% of the effort and consolidate that freight by having good connectivity between your order management system, your TMS, and your WMS, and then having good policies in place around knowing which SKUs or which items or which warehouses or which inbound or outbound partners have flexibility on their pickup or delivery dates, we can build all of those rules into how we optimize, and then begin to put it on autopilot while still measuring it and improving it with feedback loops. So from that point of view, if you take all the tech talk away and all the data talk away, it's, do we agree upon a way that those folks who, are driving forklifts can get instructions that are seamless to the way that they operate, and all of a sudden freight is getting consolidated, and where the work is taking place and the hard work takes place, it's invisible that the consolidation has already taken place. That's how you get that huge value out of it, because if you're chasing pallets on the floor and trying to consolidate them before they get out, there's value there, but that just doesn't scale.
Wow, yeah, that's a great point, Eric. I wanted to just make a point to these notable others. Just for a moment, carbon footprint reporting, something that we've noted throughout this. That's been something requested from shippers to carriers. And, all of these other things, I think they're just all important. The things that we're going to see, alternative fuel, biofuels, linked convoys eventually when autonomy reaches the market, all going to be important things for reducing carbon emissions. All right, so number 12, and this is something we kind of touched on earlier about who is driving that demand, and I spoke about consumers voting with their wallet. We asked, over the next 5 years, what factors do you see playing the largest role in creating demand for investments in environmental sustainability, and consumer sentiment and demand. Over 60% responded that. Government regulation, again, kind of something else we've noted here, the second highest response there. And Eric, so we are talking. I guess this question is kind of aligned at B2C shippers, but to the B2B shippers in the audience, explain why this pressure will inevitably flow upstream to them, or if I'm wrong in stipulating that it will, how do you think? What else would drive investments from the B2B shippers?
Yeah, I mean, again, similar to prior points, right? Lean and green don't have to be mutually exclusive. I think that. The government regulation is a really, really obvious one. Consumer sentiment, as you mentioned, right? You can get a bad rap, and that could crush your brand, especially in the B2C space. But I think that there's really just a sense of accountability that has to come into play here, which is, how do we look at, and not to sound preachy, but how do we look at the environment, knowing that we're impacting it, knowing that supply chain has such a large percentage of this, and that as operators and controller in this space, we have an opportunity to, help reimagine how our supply chains work in a way that, if we do it right, means it's good for the wallet. And that is something that's very feasible. I think a lot of folks still today simply look at some of these initiatives and it's in the too hard pile. It's almost like deer in the headlights of, where do I even start with something like this? And especially being in the infancy stages of this, a lot of companies who don't have, sophisticated supply chain maturity and are just trying to, make sure that they stay in the black and not in the red, this is, second of mind. But as you mentioned, as vendors start to say, hey, I'm going to, relocate my DCs, or I'm only going to ship on these schedules so that, I'm not doing all just in time, but I have more regular sailing schedules around product. And obviously not all product can go down that route, but you're going to start seeing different rules around ways that individual organizations can meet their sustainability goals within the supply chain. But the only way that that's going to work out is if everyone can collaborate with their other partners and understand their shipping patterns. And, today, unfortunately, we solve a lot of that problem with a ton of people on phones, scheduling appointments, trying to figure out, when they can get product in and out. and then you compound that with our, demand challenges today, and that there's no supply, these initiatives become hard. So I'll call myself out on going a bit in circles around this one, but I just think that the alignment of ethical goals with, financial, benefit is where this starts to win.
That's a pretty good lead into our next question here. We asked him, what of the following would best help overcome the barriers to implementing and executing a sustainable strategy, and partnerships were the overwhelming answer here, over 60%. Eric, we've kind of touched on this and danced around it about why partnerships will be so key, but let's dispel it totally. We're talking about companies that, as you said, maybe focused on just staying in the black, just focused on growing a little bit here and there, and this, especially given the challenges right now with moving goods, it goes to the back of the mind. So why will partnerships be so key? And then what does a partnership with Redwood entail? I know you guys are kind of in your early stages of implementing this, but you guys have been helping shippers redesign networks for decades. So talk to me about what a partnership with Redwood also entails.
Yeah, I mean, any good partner brings really good playbooks to the table, right? So I know what a nice house looks like, but I wouldn't dare build one on my own. You have folks who do things over and over because they're good at it. And I think that's, in this space, especially if you're looking at a network and you want to optimize it, and back to one of the previous slides on, are you consolidating? Are you looking at network design? Are you, reimagining, your fleet, miles per gallon reduction and stuff like that. There's so many places to start, but a partner has seen it, right? So when you work with a good partner, they'll be like, I see what you're trying to accomplish. Let me show you the playbooks that we've already run. And to your question, what Redwood does, it's really just that. We do a discovery of current state with our clients before we onboard. We understand, what are their processes in the actual real world, right? What are they doing at their desks? What's happening at the warehouses? What's happening at their partners? And we document that in workflow diagrams. It's literally boxes and arrows that we draw out, and we say, is this your previous state? And they say, yep. And, we say, great. And then we draw out what a future state would look like. And that means, integration, of systems from their orders to their financial package to TMS and WMS through Redwood Connect. That means, understanding what kind of data needs to be normalized and transformed so these systems can all work together. And then it also means, how do we optimize a TMS to do what it does best, which is run rates and figure out what things cost and what the scheduled delivery times are if they're individual or consolidated. And then we have an engineering group that will figure out, where your DCs and RDCs and, should all be, so that, we can potentially, save money and reduce shipping time there, and look at inventory and holding strategies and stuff like that. So it's stuff that, we can make sound relatively simple and make look nice, just like someone building a house. But, doing it on your own when your business is manufacturing widgets and, sourcing and procuring and getting widgets to customers, doing stuff like this is something you want to set it and forget it and just know that it's being taken care of. And that's where a good partner can help.
Yeah, thinking back to your comment on the last slide about accountability, and just being a bit of a deer in the headlights when you think about tackling something like sustainability, this bottom notable others, something that could help overcome barriers to implementing and executing a sustainability strategy. One of those notable others was companies just honestly assessing their supply chains, and that leads into kind of our final slide here of kind of what have been the investments, what have been the efforts so far. Time investment only, about 30% have said that, and then you have another 2/3 that have said they've made some sort of investment, about 15%. So they have no investment yet, but a plan to, and then just a few say they have no current plans. So thinking back to honestly assessing must be the first step, but you can't do that without having the data to do so. So let's just put a bow on this conversation and kind of wrap up what we've talked about. It starts with data-driven organization, and then you have to measure yourself to have a baseline. Those are the first two steps. Walk me through some of the next after that.
Yeah, I'll get into the weeds in a second, but just on this slide, I think it's neat to see here, though, that if you sum up, the top three, most companies have made an investment into, sustainability efforts, and even a time investment only, right? That's a significant investment. So I think there's value there. To your question, what happens? Well, it depends on what happens if it's top down or bottom up, right? If it's top down and you decide that this matters at a corporate level, you're going to put initiatives and policies in place around, high level KPIs and metrics to steer the organization around, what numbers do we care about measuring right now, and then what do we want those numbers to be in the future, right? Whether it's pounds of CO2 reduction or miles reduction or something like that. If it's a bottom up approach, right, and a lot of companies have great top down leadership, but everyone has only so many cycles in a day, and there can be bottom up initiatives where you can show use cases where green equals lean, and maybe it's added revenue opportunities, right? Consolidation and optimization. It reduces miles, but it saves a lot of money. And, you can, work on gain share opportunities with shippers to, find these ways that you can actually reduce the spend in a network and, turn that into sustainability reporting as well. So where it really goes from there is having the tools to do it, right? So obviously we've woven the data together. You want a really good TMS that can report on every load, the mileage, run algorithms to consolidate freight together based on various rules. And when you have that, you now have, an arsenal of information to use instead of, being anecdotal with your sustainability efforts. And again, winning with data is the only way to go, whether it's top down or bottom up.
All right, thank you so much, Eric. That is the end of our slides. So I will pass it back to Marianne to open it up for audience Q&A.
All right, thank you guys so much. Excellent job walking through that, as always. If you've not already submitted your questions for Andrew and Eric, you can do so through the Q&A tab in your webinar console. And we do have a couple so far, so we'll go ahead and dive right in. Andrew, this one's probably for you. This one just came through here on this last slide, but it asks, are these single choice answers, or did you allow for any response that applies? Do you happen to know that offhand?
I don't know for exactly which questions. Some questions were all that were applicable. Others were just single choice answer.
Yeah, I think it was referring to the very last slide.
The very final slide. Let me see. The very final slide is a single choice answer.
Okay, got it. Thank you very much. And next question, what initial goal setting advice would you give to a rapidly growing company just starting to monitor their transportation related carbon emissions? Eric, if you'd like to maybe start, and Andrew, if you have anything, feel free to follow up.
Yeah, I think I think the first is start measuring what you're doing today without worrying about changing anything. Find ways to measure how you operate. So let's say, you're doing a ton of truckload, right? Figure out those loads, put the miles on those lanes, and, just say, here's what we're doing on a daily basis, and dimensionalize out those numbers. And then that becomes your baseline for, if you ever reduce them or optimize or change your network, you at least have a baseline before you start making changes.
All right, perfect. And next question, for companies who don't have someone dedicated to sustainability on staff, how do you decide who should own those efforts? Any advice on that?
We struggled with that for a bit, and what we needed to do was to say someone has to own it. So we did assign it to someone, and the person that we assigned it to had a lot of knowledge across all of our various business units. And I think that helps a lot, because what you have to do is you have to dig in and you have to jump into, whether it's our technology group or our managed services group or our brokerage group, to communicate with them to understand what the day-to-day efforts are. So I think it's pretty important that, this person isn't living in a dark closet like an office space, with a stapler, just working on numbers, but interacting with people and, Zooming with everyone and getting next to people and figuring out, what initiatives are you working on, and then figuring out how we measure it. Again, I know I sound like a broken record here about measuring, but it's just so important if you ever want to prove to yourself and to your peers that you've made any kind of change.
Yeah, I concur with Eric on having sorry, Marianne, I was just going to add just something simple, but when you were asking that question, it just popped in my mind, passion. I think if you want somebody to do a good job, you need to find somebody that actually has a passion for sustainability and a passion for, driving a greener operation. So beyond someone that has, in-depth knowledge of a wide range of the operations within the business, I think finding somebody that's passionate about it is a good place to start.
Yeah, excellent advice there. And I see one more here. It says, do you see a trend of carriers creating a sort of marketplace, helping to consolidate shipments across multiple clients? Is that something that you guys are seeing?
So that's the kind of holy grail that everyone's been talking about for as long as I can remember in the industry of, imagine if carriers and shippers work together to, create static lanes with short hauls and long hauls and did the optimizing themselves. And in the past, it was about spend, and now it's greenhouse gas emission as well. The challenge there is, it's our industry, right? Hyper fragmented, things go wrong, networks break, and you're dealing with exceptions. So it's very difficult. There's this kind of hierarchy of, this journey towards greenhouse gas emissions. And there's, right at the top is collaborative, transformation, right? How do companies that are, what do we call it? Co-opetition, right? Like how do you look at folks that compete and get them to work together? And then as that goes down, right, there's, associations and 3PLs that really act as a party. Once they're accountable for the freight, they can do a lot of collaborating. But to answer the question directly, yeah, that's ideal. And perhaps when we have open platoons and, this utopia that we've been talking about for so long, I think there's a lot of value there, but it's just such a heavy lift and shift that I haven't seen it successfully implemented yet. At a small scale, yes, it makes a ton of sense. At a larger scale, like at a massive scale, that's a tough one.
Yeah, the only thing I have to add is I think the only company that I've really seen that has raised significant money and is making any headway at all, and I haven't spoken to them in several months now, is Flock Freight with their shared truckload model, basically just trying to consolidate different clients' LTL shipments into more of like a full truckload. But again, it's still a small business, and it's not by any means a significant portion of freight.
All right, great. Well, everyone, it looks like that's all of the questions that we have. So thank you so much to everyone for taking the time to listen in this afternoon. Thank you to our friends at Redwood for partnering with us on today's webinar and the research study that we conducted. And of course, thank you so much to Andrew and Eric for being here with us today to share your insights. We will be releasing the full white paper based on this study in the coming weeks. So stay tuned for that notification when it becomes available. We appreciate you being here and hope you'll join us again for another webinar very soon.